Hello, everybody. Welcome to Awake Illinois, Protect the Kids, episode 11 live stream. It is Friday, and it is June 21st. We are into summer, and I'm so excited to welcome all of you who are either in Illinois or anywhere else in the country, maybe even beyond the U.S. border, who are going to join this conversation tonight with Maia Poet. And so we're very excited to welcome her here. We're going to talk about her journey. And we actually met pretty recently at an event. And so we've been highlighting this last week that she's going to be joining. And she has just a really impressive story. She impressed me with her wisdom and with her wit and intellect. And so it is my pleasure to welcome her to this episode. And here we have Maia Poet. Welcome, Maia.
Thank you so much for having me, Shannon. I'm really excited about this opportunity.
Yeah, it's so great to connect with you and to welcome you on here. We've had a pretty dynamic array of voices join this live stream since we launched in February. And it's been everyone from parents to members of the medical community to members of the gay community, the transsexual community, just all hands on deck to bring a human perspective and a lot of hope to families that are enduring some of this gender distress and are on this journey. And so every time we do one of these live streams, more and more parents reach out to us, more and more people from across the country are just looking for help and support. And so Partners for Ethical Care is where actually we met at their event. And so this was just a couple weeks ago, and you were one of the panelists among this great group of voices, including Chloe Cole and so many others. And so this link to this event is actually going to be made available for people to watch it, because it was pretty in depth from all of the perspectives of people who have detransitioned. And so it was great to connect with you. And in this picture, you're the one holding the Stop Transitioning Kids sign. So it was so cool to connect with you. Yeah, welcome. Sorry, I'll take a breath there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking at that event. It was my first sort of speaking engagement, especially on a panel. And I thought that the layout of the panel was a particularly prudent way to run the discussion, because everybody was asked, the same or similar list of questions. There was a male panel and a female panel to sort of get those experiences. And within each of those panels, you had many different voices and experiences represented. And I think that what came out of that panel was really a lot of insight, not only for, parents and for, broader social institutions as to how to handle this entire phenomenon that we're seeing, this cultural zeitgeist of transgender identification, particularly within youth, and all of the institutional capture that has sort of precipitated it and allowed for it to proliferate in the way that it has, in the way that is leading us all to be on this live stream today. Frankly, I think it was a very prudent way to sort of get as many possible perspectives. And I really enjoyed not only speaking on that panel, but meeting everybody who was there.
Yeah, and you did great. Everybody did great. Very, very inspiring stories. And again, like you said, pretty diverse grouping with some really good perspectives. So I encourage people to watch that panel. That was just a couple weeks ago. But we're going to talk about you, Maia. And before we delve into your childhood and your journey that brought us to this live stream, we were joking a bit earlier about how Awake Illinois is proud to join the ranks of a group that's been added to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a total joke of an organization. They put us on their hate list. And, we are just one of many groups across the country that are working to empower parents and youth on the truth behind gender ideology and the harms of it. And unfortunately, this antagonistic organization has tried to discredit many groups that are doing really, really good work, including Partners for Ethical Care, Moms for Liberty, Courage is a Habit, Parents Defend Education, all really normal, good people doing really good work and have a lot of courage and a titanium backbone. And so we were thrilled to be added to their list. And this came out a couple weeks ago. So full disclosure, Maia, you are now a guest on a Southern Poverty Law Center hate list organization live stream here. So it's just so silly, where we are right now. But this is actually an inspiration and an aspiration for a lot of groups. So once you're on that list, it's like, all right, I guess we're doing a good job advocating. So thank you again for joining us. We are. Yeah.
What can I say? It's truly an honor.
Well, thank you so much. So tell us now about who you are and your youth, your upbringing, and just some of the foundation of your journey that's brought us to this live stream.
Yeah, so I'm very newly 25. I turned 25 less than a week ago. So I'm I guess, officially in the group of cognitively mature adults, allegedly.
Welcome. Great
Thank
job.
you. Thank you. It feels just like 24. Um, so, so I guess you can see in these pictures. So the picture on the left, that's me when I was born. I was born a couple months early. I weighed like 1 kilogram. I was born quite premature, and I had a lot of sort of developmental problems along the way. But I also had parents that were very on it. I come from a former Soviet Jewish background, so I would say that that ended up saving me from going the full hog and medicalizing. But I really got into, the transgender idea or the transgender fantasy at the age of 12 in the year 2012. So I was really an early adopter of
Mm-hmm.
of this life path, or of the desire to attain this life path. And it all really started when I got an iPad for my 12th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, for the first time, unlimited internet access at my fingertips. And as a little kid, I was a very passionate internet researcher. I mean, trans was not my first obsession, intellectually speaking. My first intellectual obsession, I would say, was actually with the world's tallest people, after I discovered them in the Guinness Book of World Records. And I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. I went on the internet because I wanted to know more about them. And at some point, I had realized that these people who were super tall had suffered from a pituitary tumor called acromegaly, which basically impacted their body's ability to sort of stop producing growth hormones. So they experienced very asymmetric growth, not just extremely tall heights, but incredibly asymmetric growth. And so these people died very young.
Mm-hmm.
And I took it upon myself as an 8 or 9 year old to solve this disorder, to cure it. I wanted to find out if there was a way to excise the pituitary tumor without harming surrounding functions of the body. I got really, really into it. So that was my first really intellectual obsession. And that intellectual obsession really gave me a lot of internet research skills. So when I was about 12 years old, a lot of things were going on in my life that I see as sort of precipitating this stint of transgender identification that amounted to, half of my life, at the point in which from the moment in which I encountered it and until the point in which I realized that this is a fraught and dangerous path. That was 12 years. That was half of my life. And a lot of things were going on for me at the age of 12. I would say, aside from just getting the iPad, I mean, 12 is a year that we see, or an age that we see a lot of teenagers, especially girls, getting into the idea of trans. For me, what was going on is that really I had started to experience a lot of really odd sensations in my body, particularly around girls in my class. There was a moment really in Arabic class when I was 12 where we were engaging in the American cultural ritual of passing down a stack of worksheets. Every American who's been to any kind of school is familiar with the idea of being handed a stack of worksheets and being told to take one and pass them down. So I was doing that. I was engaging in that cultural classroom ritual, and my hand had briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates. And suddenly I noticed a bunch of odd sensations in my body. My heart rate started to increase. I became really sweaty, kind of dizzy. I felt as if my body was heating up in such a way that the heat was overcoming the classroom air conditioning unit, and I was generally incredibly flustered. And as I'd opened my mouth to apologize to this girl for the brief brush of our hands, I realized that no words came out. So I became incredibly flustered. I didn't know what was going on with me. At some point, I thought that, maybe because this stack of worksheets had been handled by a bunch of preteen boys who never washed themselves, that maybe I had contracted an illness from touching that stack of worksheets. And so I wasn't totally sure what was going on. And being the little internet researcher that I was, I went on WebMD. And if there's anything that anybody knows about WebMD, it's that you can type in totally normal body aches and pains, and WebMD will tell you that you're dying. So
Right. Yeah.
I typed my symptoms into WebMD, and it generated a list of about 3 neurodegenerative conditions, some of which would kill me very shortly. So I was pretty freaked out about that.
Right.
And so at that point, I had all this stuff going on with me. I was very confused. At some point, I realized that if I just hang around the boys, I don't have these odd sensations in my body that make me feel as if I'm dying. So I basically latched onto a male peer group, and all of us, me and the boys, we had realized, that we could do something pretty strategic in order to get the attention of the girls. So we basically started incessantly pranking the teachers because we realized that our pranks elicited laughs from the girls in the class. So all of this was going on. I was in this male friend group. I was 12, and I had just gone from a school where we wore uniforms to a school where I had to pick out my own clothes. And I was starting to develop my sense of style, and I really liked the style of my male peers, and I liked the way that Ellen DeGeneres was dressing. She was one of the very few pop culture references, especially American pop culture references, that I had been exposed to, because growing up, I mostly watched like Soviet children's cartoons. And so even though I grew up in the United States, I already had this kind of different cultural background. And so anyways, like, all of this stuff was happening in my life, and I was starting to get the impression from adults in my life that my gender nonconforming appearance was really just like incredibly unacceptable. It was unacceptable for a girl to want to wear, things that I wanted to wear and to behave in the way that I was behaving. And, also, like, I had seen, growing up in a progressive American city on the West Coast, I had seen male cross-dressers. And this was explained to me under the idea of a sex change. So these men who, feel like they should be women, go to a doctor and they get all these sex change procedures. That was exposed to me in real life and also on the radio, because I'd listen to the radio every day growing up on the way to school. So a lot of things were going on, and I guess a thought just came into my mind at some point, and I thought, well, if men can do these sex changes, like, would it be possible for me? Would it be possible for a girl to become a boy? And so I went onto the internet, I typed that question into Google, and I got my answer. And that's really what started me on the route of transgender identification at the age of 12.
Wow. And so are these pictures about where that time frame was for you?
So the picture on the stairs, yeah, that would have been the year that I got into trans. That would have been probably a few months after.
Okay. So it is pretty interesting to hear from your story some parallels with many other kids who are enduring this, especially if they are developing strong, feelings with their sexuality during puberty, whether it is of the same sex or the opposite sex. And for you to be in a family where you were dealing with these sort of cultural disapprovals, and then also living in a progressive city that was infusing a lot of gender ideology and consideration in your brain, that's a lot to be navigating when you are, what I would say a pretty vulnerable brain and body. So at what point did you really go down this path then of considering maybe I should think of myself and turn myself into a boy?
So my parents never affirmed me, not even for 1 second. Like, when I came out to them at the age of 12 in 2012, they didn't affirm me. I think precisely because of that Soviet background, because in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of like sort of ideological compliance from the institutions within the government and from social institutions. And so I think that my parents naturally are very skeptical people for that reason, really, because of that background of being sort of raised in the Soviet Union. So there's a natural sort of skepticism, especially around, like, if a medical institution tells you that there's only one treatment for something, and that, everybody must behave in this specific way. I think that automatically that sets off sort of alarm bells in my family. So my parents never affirmed. And I would say that I was just dealing with all of these feelings like entirely on my own. I didn't tell anybody else about them. And in 2012, the idea of transgender really didn't have a cultural zeitgeist propelling it. It was a very new idea. And my peer group of 12-year-olds had not heard of this idea before. I was the first one. I was the only one. And I thought that for the rest of my life, I would be the only one dealing with these feelings. And I thought that at some point, when I become an adult, like, my parents aren't going to let me do this now, but I'm going to become an adult and I'm going to do it. So it was just an undiscussed thing in my family for many years, my gender issues. Although my gender nonconformity was very much pushed back against, just wanting to wear, men's clothes, or like when I was a high school debate kid, as you see in one of these pictures where I'm I'm on that skateboard thing. I loved bow ties. I made my own bow ties actually because I was not allowed to purchase them. So I became quite an avid bow tie maker. And I had this very unconventional style and this very unconventional way of being. And because that was pushed back so much against, I was never able to really integrate this sort of gender non-conforming aspect of myself within my female body. I thought of these things as being sort of fundamentally or ontologically even disconnected. So I thought they were totally incompatible. And when I was about 19 years old, my parents realized that this flirtation with transgender identification was not going away. And they basically stipulated that if they wanted, if I wanted for them to continue to financially support me through my studies, that I needed to study abroad for a year in a country that doesn't support all this stuff. And I'd been to Israel previously on a brief sort of study seminar to learn about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And really, I fell in love with Israel from the moment that I got there. Those top two pictures are both from Israel. And there were some things that really happened on this trip before I had decided to study abroad there that made me really figure out that, okay, this is the country that I need to go to. My parents think that they're going to save me from trans, but really in this country, because it's a conservative society and nobody really knows what a lesbian is outside of Tel Aviv, that I can actually live out this dream of becoming a man. And so when I decided to study abroad in Israel, that's really the moment, in which there were a few things that happened that made me realize that, oh, people in this country perceive me to be a man, whereas in the United States, I'm just perceived to be, a masculine woman. And so you can see on this upper right-hand picture by the Western Wall, this was on the trip to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was there with my girlfriend at the time, and we went to the Western Wall, which is one of the holiest sites in Judaism, and it's sex segregated. So there's a women's section and a men's section. And I had a yarmulke in my pocket. I put it on my head, and I just waltzed into the men's section. And I was greeted by this 18-year-old kid from New York, who came up to me and he said, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" And I told him I was. And then he asked me, "Are you over the age of 13?" And I thought, ouch, because I was 19. But I told him that I was. And he asked me if I had engaged in the ritual of wrapping tefillin, which are those black straps that you see going across my arms and on my head. It's a really important Jewish ritual for men who are aged 13 years and older to do. And I told him I'd never done this. And immediately he becomes extremely, extremely excited. And he runs me through this ritual. I wrap these straps. I say some prayers. And he said, he asked me afterward, he said, "So you never even did this, not even at your bar mitzvah?" And I told him that I'd never had a bar mitzvah. And he becomes really excited immediately. He yells to some of his friends in Yiddish. Next thing I know, I'm holding hands in a circle with like 5 or 6 ultra-Orthodox Jewish guys, and we're dancing around, singing songs. And then suddenly we hear a siren, and it was the Shabbat siren letting us know that the Sabbath was going to start very shortly, and that we should get back home to our families. And so this kid who had walked me through this ritual asked me for my phone. He needs help opening the camera app. I needed to teach him that you are supposed to press on the white circle in order to take a picture, because this kid had clearly never used a smartphone. And he tells me to stand in front of the wall. And I ask him, "Well, where would you like me to stand?" And he takes the picture and he says, "Well, where would you like me to take your bar mitzvah photo?" And I look at him and I say, "Excuse me, what do you mean?" And then he says, "Mazal tov, you're a bar mitzvah now." So that's the story of how I had a bar mitzvah that I didn't even know had happened until it was over. And that, I think, really cemented both my Jewish identity, which I was in the process of reconnecting to, and my male identity. And that was the moment in which I said, to myself, wow, like I need to, no matter what happens, I need to find my way back here, because I will be perceived as a man here and I will be able to live out this dream. So that's really how it started.
Okay. Well, thank you for walking us through that. And here are some more pictures. I think this is the end of some of these pictures here. So do you want to tell us what these two are?
Oh yeah, this other picture is another picture on the Western Wall in slightly higher quality. As you can see, I'm on the men's side. Behind me are a bunch of men. And the next picture is really from the Pride Parade from 2022 in Jerusalem. And at this point, I had already started to sort of question a lot of the rhetoric around, safe spaces, because like this whole transgender movement, it is in Israel too. However, in Israel, it's sort of happening with a 10-year lag. Like most American trends get to Israel with about a 10-year lag. So, as you can see, or maybe as you can't see, I was wearing a yarmulke, a kippah, a Jewish skull cap, whatever you want to call it, on my head, and it's a rainbow one. If you go to the other picture, yeah, I'm wearing a rainbow. Exactly, yeah, I'm wearing a rainbow skull cap there, and on this poster here, I wrote, "I don't need your safe space. I need safe people." And that's really a testament to what it's like to be, very nonconforming in this way, especially gay in the Middle East, is that your priorities are very different. The safe space debate that we're having in the United States, it just seems to me to be a bunch of first world nonsense, frankly, because the Western world is overwhelmingly accepting of homosexuals. Whereas in the Middle East, especially in Jerusalem, I mean, I'd had a friend who was murdered by his own family in an honor killing after his homosexuality was discovered. So
Wow.
the debates happening in the Middle East, especially in Israel, which is like the only sort of gay-friendly country in the Middle East, the priorities are really very different. Yet a lot of this Western discourse around needing to have these sterilized sort of safe spaces where there's no dissonance, there's no pushback, there's absolutely sort of no disagreement or no discussion. Even though in the Middle East, the priorities for gay people are very, very different, because depending on which city you're in, it's literally a fight for your rights and for survival. Still, we see that through the English language, these discourses of like safe spaces and all of this like Western ivory tower nonsense is also being sort of copy pasted into a country that really ought to be having very different priorities for its right, its fight for gay rights. So that's really, I think, what that picture encapsulates.
I see. It is interesting to hear the differences, right, between Israel and what you've seen in the Middle East and what's happening here. So I'm going to close out of this for a second and have you walk us through when you were living in Israel and you were preparing to go to a concert. And when you were on the panel for Partners for Ethical Care, you talked about the aftermath of this, and it became an even bigger wake-up call for you to not continue down the path of transition. So why don't you take us to that time period in the fall of last year?
Yeah. So, but before I talk a little bit about sort of the post-October 7th world and the way in which that pulled the trigger, I think it's prudent to actually go back to really the first major catalyst for me questioning this entire life path.
Yeah.
So I sort of, I guess, trace my process of sort of the beginning of my ideological divestment from this transgender fantasy. I really process this, and I think back to where this all started for me, the questioning of whether or not this is a good life path to go down. I trace that back to a moment in May of 2021 when I was experiencing my first war in Israel. I trace all of this back to a moment that I experienced in a bomb shelter in May of 2021. I was with a different girl at this time, and we were going to a drag show, of all things, in Tel Aviv. And we were delaying our departure endlessly because the cats needed to be fed, and then a glass of water spilled, and it's just two people with ADHD and total planning chaos. So we kept saying, okay, after this task, we'll get on the bus and we'll go to Tel Aviv. So we kept pushing our departure back, and at some point we had heard a siren, and I look at her and I ask her, like, what's going on? And she's like, oh, they're launching rockets at us. And I'm like, well, what are we supposed to do? And she says, we need to go to a bomb shelter. And then I look at her and I'm like, where's the bomb shelter? And she's like, I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood. So the first few sirens, we run down to the sort of bottom level of the apartment complex because you're much less likely to get hit either by a rocket or by rocket debris when you're in the lower level as opposed to when you're in the higher levels of this apartment complex. So at some point, we had eventually figured out where the bomb shelter was, and there were 2 cats. And so every time we heard a siren, you're already like limited in the amount of time you have from the moment you hear the siren until the moment that you need to find yourself in a bomb shelter one way or another. And
Mm-hmm.
so we had to pack these cats up every single time, run to the bomb shelter. And there were a couple times, sort of, when I didn't make it to a bomb shelter in time, and I was stuck with my girlfriend and these 2 cats, and we were hiding under a tree, watching rockets fly over our heads and rip through the air. And it's really an utterly terrifying experience.
Sure.
And it was at this moment when a thought sort of came through my mind, which was, what if I'm right now finding myself in a hospital recovering from top surgery, from an elective radical double mastectomy, and I can't raise my hands above my shoulders and I hear a siren and I need to run and save myself? Like, what will come of me then?
Right.
So I had this sort of fleeting thought, but you can't really think in a very coherent way when you're scared for your life. So, anyways, the next time I had made it to the bomb shelter with a girlfriend and the cats. And inside of bomb shelters, bomb shelters are just incredibly depressing places to be, especially for somebody of my generation, because there's no Wi-Fi. So you're stuck contemplating your own mortality. Like, you're hearing these
Sure.
rockets, you're hearing the missiles being intercepted, you're hearing these massive explosions, and they shake the foundation of whatever building you're in. Even in a bomb shelter, the walls around you, really the earth under you, is shaking. It's an utterly terrifying experience. And because there's no Wi-Fi, you have to sit in that. You have to contemplate your own mortality. So I was running back and forth in between these bomb shelters, and really, when you're living through war, you put your entire life entirely on hold. Like, for the 11 days of that war, I didn't even shower because I was terrified that I'd have soap in my hair and then I'd hear a siren and I'd have to run to a bomb shelter in a towel. So I just didn't shower for 11 days. Like, most people just put their lives on hold. And the one thing that you can do to sort of distract yourself temporarily is to go on social media, because of course you can turn your phone off at any moment if you need to and run. So I made the mistake of going on Instagram, and I saw the ways in which, my lefty American friends who had never lived through war were discussing this war and basically justifying the actions of terrorists. And because I remember being in their shoes, before I moved to Israel, I actually used to be one of these pro-Palestinian campus activists. And what had
Really?
shifted, yeah, because I
Wow.
because I had studied Arabic from the age of 12. So I was
Mm-hmm.
already like very much sort of associated with Arabs. And because I come from this sort of former Soviet background, like in the Soviet Union, religion was illegal. And being Jewish as an ethnicity alone was a very unfavorable thing to be. So a lot
Mm-hmm.
of Soviet Jews lost their cultural and religious connections to their Jewish roots under communism. So
Right.
in my family, we really had no idea of what does it mean to be Jewish outside of sort of being victims of continual genocides and also being like highly intellectual people that have to fight against the odds. Like, I had no real conception of what it means to be a Jew outside of that. I had no real connection to being a Jew or to other Jews. So naturally, I would take the Arab side. And I was also a debate kid. I went to a debate camp in the summer of, I think it was 2016, where they were giving us a topic lecture about the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And it was really some random white dude who gave us this lecture. He wasn't Jewish, he wasn't Palestinian, he wasn't Arab, he wasn't Israeli. Frankly, he was nothing. He was not even very intelligent. He certainly had like he certainly had no
Right.
authority to be giving us this lecture. And he sort of produced a lecture that was very much on the pro-Palestinian side, with a bunch of like just inaccurate information, and again, just justifying terrorists and terrorist actions. Any terrorist action was considered to be an action that would liberate Palestine, and therefore was justified. And he blamed the Jews for everything. And so I was the only Jew in the room, and naturally I took that all of that guilt that my people were responsible for all the suffering in the world. I took that upon myself. So it makes perfect sense as to sort of why I got into this pro-Palestinian activism. And because I had lived in the Middle East, and because I had realized at this point the incredible importance of there being a Jewish state, because Jews in the diaspora cannot count on these other countries to protect them, as our people have seen time and time again. So I'd realized the importance of having a Jewish state, and I had realized that a lot of these Western leftists don't know what they're talking about. And all of these Western leftists, you know, yeah, and all these Western leftists, you know, it was so clear to me that they were brainwashed and indoctrinated into
Sure.
the same types of thought that I, had been indoctrinated into, but they hadn't had the opportunity to live in the Middle East and to understand how their arguments, their very pro-genocidal arguments actually play out in real life, and how all of their theorizing and hypothesizing doesn't actually make a difference when you're literally running from rockets and terrorists.
Right.
So and I trusted these kids' ability, or these young adults' ability, to engage in coherent logical reasoning, because these are people who I'd overwhelmingly met at high school debate tournaments. And we'd all received the same training about how to construct an effective and non-fallacious argument with ethos, pathos, and logos. We knew which logical fallacies to stay away from. So I trusted these peers of mine and their ability to sort of reason and engage in rational, coherent argumentation. But I thought the only barrier between, them and where they're at now, and me and where I was at that moment, was, access to adequate information. So I went on the internet and I started, finding coherent and credible sources that my peers could fact check to prove to them that this terrorist group, Hamas, that they are supporting, not only wants to kill all the Jews and wipe the Jewish state, off the face of the map before, of course, moving to the West, as is their stated goal in their charter. Not only do they want to wipe off, the Jewish state from the face of the map and all the Jews, but they're willing to and quite happy to sacrifice as many Palestinian lives as is humanly possible in order for them to garner Western sympathies that they can then, blame these deaths on the Jews, as they use Palestinians as human shields. So I needed to explain to my, Western and mostly just my American lefty friends and peers that they're supporting, that even if they don't care about the Jews, which I'm fundamentally now convinced that they don't, and that their pro-Palestinian position actually is not based on any care for Palestinians, but is purely based on anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews, and also just the lack of knowledge of the full extent of what they're actually supporting and the illiberal nature of it. I thought that if I can provide them with information that shows them that they're not getting the full story, that they would have enough intellectual humility, especially for a group of people who claims, or at least purports to care so much about the importance of lived experience. I'm literally living through war, and my Palestinian friends are also living through this war, and that maybe they would have a little bit of humility and a little bit of intellectual honesty, and be enough sort of cognitively plastic in order to entertain my arguments, and in order to sort of combine my arguments within their logical calculus and come to a more comprehensive understanding of a war that's happening thousands of miles away that they could not even possibly conceptualize. But my assumptions that providing them with more information would improve or at least chip away at their tendency towards black and white thinking ended up being fundamentally and thoroughly incorrect. A lot of these young people started yelling at me online, calling me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer. And it was really at this moment when I started to realize that even these highly intellectual kids who I'd known from debate, who we had, sat together for hours over frozen yogurt discussing Kant and Nietzsche and Marx and Heidegger and Baudrillard and all these philosophers, these people actually were not using any kind of critical philosophical thinking, but rather that they were just incredibly ideological and unwilling to and unable to, even as being highly educated people, of being able to recognize the limits of their sort of Western or American vantage point. So that was the first thing that made me sort of disenchanted with the left. But the next thing, and I'm sure that all the parents listening to us can attest to this, that sort of came out of my rapid internet search to try to provide my peers with better and more accurate information, was really that algorithms are incredibly powerful. And in the process of searching for this pro-Israel content from credible sources, I had unwittingly been launched into the newest iteration of the American culture wars that had started raging. And because the pro-Israel position was aligned with the, basket of acceptable ideas on the right-wing side of this cultural wars, the algorithm had started to suggest to me other content that was in line with other acceptable ideas in the right-wing basket of thought. And I started to see content about the, Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of George Floyd, and a really very strong discussion of critical race theory and the way it's being injected into our schools, and the way in which this is causing great social upheaval and great social division. And then along the line of, going down deeper into the rabbit hole, I had really started to become more entrenched and more exposed to gender critical thought. And it started with these like compilations of reactions to woke TikToks. And because I didn't find that, I found it like, I guess, enlightening, because I wasn't super entrenched within the trans community, even when I was in the United States. I much actually preferred to hang out with the Saudi international students and just the Arabs in general, instead of the queer community, because I found the Arabs to be interesting and the queer community to be pretty shallow in the types of intellectual explorations that were allowed to go on there. So I didn't see the ways in which this phenomenon or this zeitgeist started to consume not only more of my peer group, but just more of the discussions politically and in general. So I was sort of removed from the ways in which, this idea that I had been exposed to when I was 12, that I thought these thoughts and this desire to become a man, like I'm going to have to go to my grave with these thoughts. I didn't realize that the society had really swallowed these ideas whole and unquestioningly. So I guess seeing those, compilation of reaction to woke TikTok videos really showed me the ways in which this phenomenon was spreading. But I didn't actually get stuck in just watching those woke reactions, because at some point it became pretty boring for me to watch unhinged people with crazy hair. I wanted to delve deeper. And so I started going down into the rabbit hole of sort of the gender critical stuff, and the first stories of detransitioners had really popped up. And with the first wave of detransitioners, when I watched their stories, I actually at first became much more serious about my transgender identity, because I didn't relate to these stories, because a lot of these young women who were coming out as detransitioners were very feminine and often heterosexual. And I thought, well, obviously these types of girls are going to regret trying to become men. Like, why would they do it? It doesn't make any sense. Like, even when I was still trans identified and I started to see some straight girls, start to medicalize, I thought it was pretty confusing. I thought, why would any straight person do this? Only gay people do this. Like, the straight people, they're giving up a good thing here. Like, this is only something that gay people do. Like, that was my thought. It was like transition was a way to escape being gay. So I had seen these detransition stories. I didn't relate to them. And I thought, well, this is further evidence that I'm really, a true transsexual, especially because I had delved into the early clinical reports of sort of female gender dysphoria. And the first, clinical cohorts of females experiencing gender dysphoria were really what we would now call butch lesbians. They were the more masculine woman in a female partnership. And they would present to these clinics really without significant distress around their body, because most of them were adults and they'd worked through that with puberty. But they wanted to, become men so that they could, quote unquote, marry their female friend. And that was the story overwhelmingly that showed up with female, gender dysphoria. And this was considered to be the sort of case of true transsexualism within females. And I fit that clinical criteria perfectly. So for a couple of years, I was sort of, bouncing around the sort of space of the idea of like the true transsexual. And it wasn't until years later that I had met detransitioners, including some butch lesbians, that I realized, like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, these very masculine women who, because of their masculine presentation and because of the sort of medicalization that they'd undergone, I couldn't even tell that they were female. And yet, I was sitting next to them, and automatically the category of woman had somehow just expanded to include me in it, when I had received messages really from the moment in which I decided to present and behave in very gender non-conforming ways, that was unacceptable and that was somehow incompatible with my female body. Like, not only did I get that from these sort of more traditional and homophobic viewpoints, but I also got this from these internet ideologues who are saying that these gender nonconforming behaviors are evidence that your body is wrong and that you need to correct your healthy female body, which this ideology sort of posits is a pathology. And the evidence of your healthy female body as a pathology is that you have these gender nonconforming behaviors. So I really internalized these ideas, and I met detransitioners, butch lesbian detransitioners, and I realized for the first time in my life, like, whoa, there are people who are so similar to me. They undergo these interventions and they still regret it. So that was one sort of major turning point. And I met them at a GenSpec conference about a year ago. But then I went back to Israel and I continued to live as a man, because really, what choice did I have? You know, I had built a life over there. And I was employed and I was involved in all of this peace activism, including working with children. And all these children knew me as a guy. And already I had realized that it like, if I were to detransition, that would mean exposing all of these kids to the idea of transgenderism. So, you know, there was a fundamental sort of moral conflict that I had, which is, on one hand, you shouldn't lie to kids about your sex or their sex or about reality in general. So that was sort of one set of moral frameworks and positions that I'd held. And then the other one that really conflicted with it is that you shouldn't expose kids to this idea in the first place. So these are fundamentally conflicting, because, of course, being truthful with the kids about my biological sex and what I actually am is, on one hand, a moral thing to do, but on the other hand, it would venture into this immoral territory of exposing them to the concept in the first place. So I still continued to live as a man, because what was I really supposed to do? And, you know, and then a few other things happened that made me really sort of pull the trigger and realize that I have to give up this fantasy entirely and I have to rebuild my life from scratch. And I would say that the moment in which I truly pulled the trigger on desistance or detransition was really in the aftermath of October 7th. So I guess I'll go back in this place, you know, in this part of the story, to October 6th, because the day before, you know, these Hamas terrorists had really done these awful, genocidal, violent attacks, you know, within Israeli communities. Like, the day before that, I was actually doing a peace event with Jewish and Arab children in a Bedouin village, and all of these kids were incredibly young. And because we were in the environment of this village, and because you had, you know, the parents and the kids who lived in that village, these Bedouin families, and then, you know, we brought our own kids who were, you know, Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab children as well, and they were all playing together, and it was so incredibly peaceful. Like, if a kid fell down and needed help, it was the nearest adult to them who helped them, who picked them up, and who comforted them. And it didn't matter if this adult was from the same religious or ethnic background from the child. It didn't even matter if they spoke the same language. It was just, there are children and there are adults, and these adults have a responsibility to these children to create a safe, protective, and nurturing environment in which these kids can get to know each other, not as each other's enemies, but as each other's neighbors and each other's potential best friends. And by the end of the event, all of these kids had picked up a few words in Arabic and Hebrew and English and Russian and French, whatever they were speaking, or even just nonsense gibberish baby words, right? They'd picked up, you know, certain modes of communication which showed in a very material, measurable way that they were connecting with each other. And I went on Instagram and I made all of these hopeful posts about, like, guys, like, look at this amazing connection. And you know, we can't rely on our horrible leaderships. We can't rely on terrorist groups in the region to bring us peace. But what we can do is invest in our children and teach them that they are not each other's enemies. And I was so hopeful. And I made all these posts. And then on October 7th, I woke up to a siren. At 8 in the morning, I woke up to a siren, and my world was just changed in ways that I could never even begin to contemplate. And as I'd run to, I was in a new neighborhood, so I went through the whole process of not knowing where the bomb shelter was, going, you know, in the staircase, hearing these rockets. And I knew that something was different on October 7th, because the city in which I lived, we don't normally get rockets during war, but we were getting rockets one after the other. And, you know, I guess I'd gone onto the internet and I had seen that that terrorists had invaded a music festival. And over some period of time, I I realized that I was actually this happened at a music festival that I was supposed to be at, the Nova Festival. And what really saved me from being at that festival was the fact that my friends are a bunch of chaotic Jews and Arabs who are extremely bad planners. And if there's anything you know about organizing a group with like 4 or 5 people in it and trying to get everybody to respond in time and to get everybody, into the same place and time, it's that it's almost impossible. So, there were a lot of logistical and sort of coordinating problems, people dropping out, new people wanting to join, and we needed to find a sober driver. And our sober driver at some point had gotten so fed up with us, and he said, "Look, I need a beer just to deal with you people. I'm not going to be your sober driver." So, and that happened a few days before we were sort of supposed to go to the festival. And, the price of the tickets had already gone up so much, and we were willing to buy the tickets at the door, but like they had gotten so expensive that the sober ride dropped out. And we were like, all right, whatever, this isn't happening, whatever. So that's why I ended up actually at this peace event with the Jewish and Arab children, is because instead of getting ready to go to this festival, I just decided to do something else with my weekend. So,
Wow.
yeah, like when I heard that siren, when I'd woken up to that siren at 8 in the morning, I was totally discombobulated. The only thing I had time for was to grab my glasses and really run. And I didn't have time to put on my binder. And this was a really key moment for me, because even though I had psychologically desisted and realized that in like that sort of undergoing these invasive and radical and experimental and dangerous medical procedures, in the best case scenario, what it can give me is that like I'll be happy in the male social role, but I'll experience some medical complications, and some of them that I can predict and some of them that I can't predict, because this is also experimental and new. And the worst case scenario is not only that I experience massive medical complications that are nearly fatal, as some people have attested to, not only will I experience this physical harm to my material body, but on top of that, that I might actually regret the social role and regret the fact that I had never given myself a chance to just be a lesbian. So, even though before October 7th, I had weighed up these ideas in my head and done sort of a type of logical calculus here, and realized that transition is not a great idea, not very practical, especially living in a country where wars can break out at any time. And you never know, like you cannot predict when you're going to hear a siren. Like I couldn't predict that any of this was going to happen. I was doing a peace event with kids, and then a few hours later, I wake up to a bunch of terrorists killing people. And so I didn't have the chance to put on a binder. And a binder, for those who don't know, is a barbaric compression garment that basically girls and women will wear to squash their breasts, to make their chest appear more masculine, in order to aid in them sort of passing as men. And it is an intervention that you don't need a doctor to sign off on, but yet it is an intervention that can cause extreme medical harm. For me, it has certainly caused harm, and I didn't have the chance to put on that binder that day. So I just, and even as I'm running for my life, I'm thinking like, everybody can see my breasts and everybody knows me as a guy in this neighborhood. What am I going to do? And so even as I'm running for my life, like this ideology is so pervasive that even as I'm running and trying to save myself, I'm still fixated on my chest. So I take a bunch of shirts, I layer them on, didn't have a chance to put on the binder. I run for my life into this bomb shelter. And I have to, face, because I'm not constricting my body and its movement in any way, I have to face the natural movement of my body as I'm running to try to save myself. And I realized a couple of things. I mean, I realized first and foremost how important it is for me to have my female body fully intact, even though it is extremely uncomfortable physically and psychologically to be running and to not have that kind of constriction or compression. And it was really at that moment that I realized, whoa, like there's something really important about maintaining the integrity of my healthy body. And really, at the next level, that really, like, my body, even though for so many years I thought of my body, my healthy female body, existing in its natural state as being a state of pathology that needs to be corrected with surgical and hormonal interventions from the moment that I become like financially independent of my parents, I started to see that entire framework as being incredibly flawed, because for the first time, I realized that my body is capable. My body is not a pathology, and my body is the only thing that's going to keep me alive, and allow me to save myself, which I can only do when it's in its most healthy state and not sort of surgically or hormonally impeded in some ways. And so that was a really major turning point in my life that made me realize, and sort of in a way make peace with myself and with my body, or at least allow myself to start doing that, even though my ideological divestment had really occurred far before then.
Wow. It's pretty powerful to hear your story, Maia. Thank you for taking us down all of what happened with your testimony and being in Israel and being at war and ultimately having to settle the war within yourself. And I'm just so glad that you're here and that you're in a good spot. And so let's go through, let's dissect some of what you experienced and kind of apply it to what you know is happening right now, because you were in the early wave, as you mentioned, of this. And right now, the wave is like cresting, right? And so we're seeing how this has been so wrongly normalized on social media. It's not the exception. It has been normalized. It's being brought into schools. You mentioned the binder. There are nurses and school staff at our publicly funded K through 12 schools here in Illinois, and I know in many other states, where they are equipped with binders that they are to give girls in school. I mean, just think about that. Think about these young kids. And I'm very worried for the gay children. I really am. I'm worried for the members of the gay community that are in school and that are very vulnerable right now, because they are looped into this contagion. And some teachers and staff may think they're doing the right thing. I'm sure many of them think that they are saving children from suicide, and they've been told all of these lies. Some are just, I think, really warped people, and they just take pleasure in this ideology. And there are a number of different things as to motivating these people, but this is already happening, where this is being normalized and permitted in schools. They're not telling parents. And so that is where we as organizations and as voices and as parents and as peers, we have to just get over the fact that people are going to say bad things about you. Like, this is happening, right? And so we need to empower people to know that this is wrong. And your story is one of many that need to be shared. And so this is happening in a hyperbole. And you had the benefit of being, basically an adult by the time you were in the thick of a lot of this when you were in Israel. But some of these kids are much younger. And so we have to be the barrier right now. And so that's where your story comes in. Talk to us about, I'm going back through some of the notes that I took here. What would you say to parents right now, Maia, that are in your parents' position as they would have been in 2012, where there's a lot more of this contagion? It is normalized. You're the cool kid. You're the protected kid at school. If you're in all of these, gay straight alliance clubs, and you're getting the chest binders, you're thinking about puberty blockers. What would you say right now to parents, and what advice do you wish your parents maybe had heard when they were about to see you embark on this, gender distress? What would you say to parents right now?
So I'm not a parent, and I really do not envy the parents who are in a situation where their child is questioning their gender, or it seems like this is, the rabbit hole they're getting sucked into. Like, I really don't envy any of you guys. And I don't think there's a one size fits all solution to get your kids out of transgender identification, but I do have some tips that really would have helped me. And I guess when I think about the ways in which my parents, who had very good intentions, handled this, and they're like, the way they employed certain strategies, and some of these strategies worked, and some of these strategies really backfired. What I would say for most parents is that, gender dysphoria, or this transgender identification, there's a reason why teenagers get so invested into it. And it's because this ideology promises them a lot of things. It promises them that, in all this discomfort that they're going through, that they can become a different person, and that this discomfort will be alleviated. And they don't have enough life experience. They haven't experienced a loving adult relationship. They haven't experienced really much of life. They're existing in their heads, and they're contemplating all of these very big and very abstract ideas. And they also have a lot of distress going on. I mean, I haven't heard of a single trans-identified teenager who is just like extremely happy-go-lucky. They get exposed to the idea of trans, and then they become like super fully immersed into it. Like, there's always some kind of distress or uncertainty or identity exploration going on. And I think that what would have helped me is if my parents had recognized my distress instead of dismissing it, instead of saying, this is going to be a phase, we're not doing anything about this, we're not talking about this, this is ridiculous. Like, you may think all of those things as a parent, and those are all legitimate things to think. You might blame yourself. You might blame your kids. But I think that blame is an incredibly and entirely unhelpful emotion when it comes to problem solving, because blame is what the trans ideologues are really, that's the mindset that they're trying to get your kids into. They're trying to get your kids, especially if you're not affirming, they're trying to distance you from your kids. So playing the blame game is fundamentally unhelpful here. It fractures the internal familial unit in the exact ways that the ideologues want, in order so that they can have like access to your vulnerable children and their vulnerable developing plastic minds. So I think that actually a better strategy, and having lived through several Middle Eastern wars, I do think that the battle that parents are up against right now, the situation that they find themselves in, is a situation of war. You need to be highly strategic, because
100%.
you're playing an ideas game. And unfortunately, your care for your child is not the majority opinion that your kid is surrounded with. Like, even when I got into transgender identification as a 12-year-old, the cultural context was very different, in that, you know, if I had told teachers that I was dealing with this, they almost certainly would have told my parents. And that fear is what kept me from telling anybody. So you are like, right now, like the kids that are getting wrapped up in this transgender identification, I think that even the peer clusters look slightly different. Like, in my generation, it would have been kids who were like incredibly distressed, and a lot of them were gay, and a lot of them, you know, especially because I came to it before gay marriage was legalized. So I thought that, you know, if I ever wanted to marry a woman, I would literally have to become a man. And that was part of my calculus too. So like, I was growing up even in a somewhat different cultural framework, in a context where every institution was not affirming, and every institution would not become affirming for several years, you know, until several years after I got into my first, you know, stint of transgender identification. What's happening now is that kids who are actually much less troubled and much less vulnerable from the perspective of comorbidities, like than the cohort that I was a part of, they had many more psychological comorbidities, the ones that got into trans. They didn't just have, like, you know, autism and something else. Like, they had, you know, also history of abuse. Like, they had
trauma.
Right. Like, every single trans-identified kid, you know, in my age group that had, of course, gotten into it several years after I had, I mean, the vast majority of them were incredibly, incredibly troubled and dysfunctional. And that's what precipitated the transgender identity. These days, this concept is so incredibly mainstream that, I mean, and the concept of non-binary especially, like the idea of non-binary is just overwhelmingly frivolous in ways that even binary trans isn't, because you're trying to approximate something that does not lend itself to social cohesion in any way, shape, or form. And that there's not even a model for finding these types of interventions as resembling anything that could occur within nature. So, I mean, it's a highly creative, sort of highly disembodied thing. And it is so mainstream that all of these institutions are really conspiring against you and against the best interests of your kid. And it's not as if they're doing it from an evil place, because, you know, these teachers and these, you know, doctors who practice the affirmation model, they are also, they are in a way, you know, being victimized. Their best practices and their sort of clinical expertise is being victimized and hijacked by basically activists who have infiltrated our incredibly vulnerable, as it turns out, institutions, like, who would have thought, like, I thought that American institutions were far more strong and far more immune to this type of
Yeah.
ideological capture than they evidently have been.
And the
And
American Academy of Pediatrics is based here in Illinois. They have adopted
wow.
this gender ideology. And Lurie Children's Hospital, they're the ones that are equipping nurses and counselors with the chest binders and with information on puberty blockers. So you're right. It's a vicious cycle where you have so many different institutions and so many layers. You're right. Parents are up against a giant beast, and this is a war on our children. There's no question about it. That is not hyperbole. This is literally what is happening. So you're right. I'm sorry. Continue.
Oh yeah, no, it's absolutely, like you said, it's a war on your children. And the thing is that the reason why all of these like teachers and doctors are like hell bent on transitioning your child is not because they're evil. The surgeons, I would say, absolutely are, because of how much money, how much profit is to be made. But a lot of these sort of teachers and other professionals, they've also been brainwashed into believing that this is a civil rights issue, that this is an oppressed group of people. And they liken it very much to the way that a lot of gay kids, like teenagers, who were facing homophobia both from their classmates and often at home, the way in which they were not protected. And
Mm-hmm.
because of the way that the T and the Q have been lumped onto LGB, what we see is that once like gay marriage was legalized federally within the United States, which I believe was in June of 2015, if I'm correct, that really, these organizations needed to find a way to continue employing the people within these organizations. And so they pivoted towards trans, and they used the frameworks of gay rights. They used the arguments of gay rights, like the
Mm-hmm.
born this way arguments. They used all of the same frameworks and the same organizational infrastructure in order to absolutely obliterate the rights of gay people, the rights of women, and to destroy the bodies of kids who are likely to grow up to be gay and haven't even
Yes.
realized it, as well as
Right.
kids who are vulnerable, who aren't going to grow up to be gay and are vulnerable for a variety of different reasons. So,
yes. And real quickly,
yeah.
I will say Jeff Cleghorn was, he's in Georgia. He testified against all of this gender ideology happening in schools. He was actually in the Army and was part of the advocacy for gay rights in the military. And he speaks to how, everybody just wanted to live their lives peacefully, to have equal rights, but that it just turned into something much darker after that, right? This infusion of the trans and the gender ideology. And Scott Nugent from the What is a Woman documentary of Trey Boyce's Scream Louder, she talks about, as a lesbian, how she was, the gay community was told, oh, they're going to come for the kids. And they were saying, no, 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 no. And of course, there was so much money to be had in all of these organizations, so much money. And look at where we are now with GLSEN and with the Trevor Project. There is tons of money in this activism and coming for the kids. So yeah, you're right.
Right. And it's and
the gay, one more thought on that. The members of the gay community are very worried to be parlayed now into this transitioning of children, right? So there's this like LGBTQ infighting that's happening now, and it's very intense. And you have Gays Against Groomers organization that's sounding the alarm. They're saying, hey, we are not for all of this grooming behavior and this movement to come for the children. And so that is why with this live stream, we have welcomed members from the gay community to speak, to all hands on deck for these kids, right? We don't have time to waste. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. Like I absolutely agree with everything you've said. And I think that the sort of empirical evidence and the case studies that you've brought in with like Scott Nugent and other, gay regretters, desisters, detransitioners, I think it's a really important voice to have, because a lot of gay people, I think, that haven't woken up to the dangers and the harms, I think there are a couple misconceptions that they have. First and foremost, they think that, that a kid who isn't, truly trans would never say that I'm literally a boy or I'm literally a girl, especially before they experience like a sexual awakening in adolescence or adulthood. But the truth is that a lot of these kids will say that because they haven't realized that what explains their nonconformity is a likely homosexual trajectory. So these kids, they have the model of boy and girl. They don't know what love is. Like when I got,
right,
or at least romantic love, like when I got into trans identification at the age of 12, I was experiencing crushes, but I didn't know what a crush was. I thought that Crush was an orange soda that my peer group was obsessed with in the same way as they were obsessed with like silly bands, kendamas, and penny boards. I thought it was a trend, that they were really obsessed with this orange soda, and that this trend would, after it waxed, that it would wane, and that my peer group would jump onto the next thing. But it turns out that that Crush was not an orange soda, and that it was actually a slang term for this type of sort of romantic awakening. So like, I didn't know what was going on with me, and I was 12. I was 12.
Yeah.
So if you think about these kids who are like 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, like if you have a little boy who really wants to wear dresses and will die on that hill, and really wants sparkly nail polish and will die on that hill, like, since forever, we've known what the likely trajectory of those kids will be. Everybody has known it, from parents who say, "Oh, I knew he was gay from the beginning," and all the way from parents who said, "Oh, this is too much. I'm going to, like, beat this out of my child." Like, everybody until like 5 seconds ago knew what the overwhelmingly likely trajectory of this type of a child was. And we're not talking about a kid who, like, his sisters dressed him up and he went along with it. We're talking about a kid who the essence of their self-expression is very non-conforming. Like, we've known until 2 seconds ago what the likely outcome of these kids is going to be. And because these activists and these ideologues have absolutely, like, captured every single one of our institutions one by one, from our courts, who will take kids away from, especially in divorces, the non-affirming parent, all the way to, educational institutions where you can't opt your kids out of learning these unscientific, unevidenced, dangerous ideas that will influence them, all the way to medical institutions who practice the affirmation model, mental health care that totally is just decided to throw out everything that we know about how child development works. Let's just toss it out, because some ideologues have told us to, and because, we're going to be threatened if we don't, all the way to, I mean, these evidence-based societies like endocrinologists who meet in their endocrinological conferences, and who, for basically any other medical issue, are allowed to discuss, the benefits and the drawbacks of X treatment over Y treatment, and to discuss the efficacy and the strength of the evidence, or the lack thereof. When it relates to quote unquote gender affirming care, they're not allowed to do that anymore, because those institutions where the evidence base, which is the entire, like, evidence base is so important within medicine, because that's the only way that we can ensure that we are intervening in people's bodies in a way that is ethical, right? So, like, these debates have been stemmed at every single level within, especially American society, and really broadly within other Western societies. Although I will say that Europe is starting to reverse course, precisely because in the United Kingdom, because you have a socialized healthcare system where the government actually does have a stake in, like, whether or not it's providing good treatments to people, they have the safeguard of systematic reviews of evidence. Where, there's a mandate at some point, where there's a framework for being able to mandate somebody looking at the evidence and determining whether or not, the evidence is good enough to justify the treatments. And in this case, with the CAST review, which I recommend that everybody, reads, it became overwhelmingly clear that the evidence supporting this treatment, not only for children, but also for adults, for literally anybody, that it's all experimental. It's experimental medicine that's being done outside of experimental conditions. And, that this is really shaky territory, that it really, there's not enough evidence to call this healthcare of any kind. It's, it has like a 100% rate of iatrogenic harm, because you're intervening in a healthy body and making that healthy body prone to extremely, severe, in some cases, even fatal medical complications.
And we've had on this live stream Dr. Quentin Van Meter, who is a former president of the American College of Pediatricians, where he speaks to, the disruption and to the harms done. And you mentioned Europe. That is our crystal ball. Like, we're latent, right? We're a late wave. But they closed Tavistock, the UK gender clinic, because of all the harms that they had uncovered. WPATH, these doctors that are in there, they know the harms that are being done. It's just, I think, to your point, many of them are afraid. They're not willing to, whistle blow. Some are starting to, Dr. Ethan Heim out of Texas, these brave and courageous people are starting to speak up. But you're right. We have to speak to the harms of this, which, again, I keep saying, this is not hyperbole. And so the teachers, the counselors, the pastors, the parents, everybody has to know the truth behind this. And it takes many different dimensions and perspectives, the medical one, right? The ethical concerns, the the policymakers, the judges, all of these people have to be on the same page, or these kids are going to be failed by a number of different people.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one more point, on the reason why we think so many doctors are getting, involved in this, including the WPATH doctors who admit that, like in Schellenberger's WPATH files, it becomes very obvious through videos that were collected from these doctors, discussing the treatments and discussing the patient pool, is that it's very clear that these doctors know that their patients are incapable of consenting because they just haven't gone through like high school biology class, and they just are not cognitively, even far beyond that, are not cognitively mature enough, to give up things like sexual function, and like having your healthy body intact and healthy bones and like full cognitive maturity, like they're just, and the ability to bear children. Like these kids, these clinicians realize that these kids, are not able to consent, but rather than saying, whoa, maybe we should reconsider our path, they think, okay, how do we get a kid who has multiple personalities, multiple personality disorder? How do we get consent from that patient? Do we need to ask every single personality? Like, they're so invested in the ideology that they are willing to sort of suspend all of their disbelief in order to continue these treatments. And the reason why they're willing to continue these treatments at all possible costs is not just because it's profitable, although that is an extremely, extremely powerful motivator. Yep. It's really because, and you can look even back to the original Dutch clinicians, like the Dutch protocol is really like when these treatments were pioneered in the Netherlands, like the first, inklings of gender medicine, you can really trace all of this back to the Netherlands and the way in which it gets to the United States. Via Christine Jorgensen, who gets this into the public zeitgeist in the 1950s. But like, if you look to the original Dutch clinicians, the reason they started performing gender transitions on youth is because they noticed that the outcomes for adult transsexuals were very poor, that it didn't increase their functioning because they were, and the Dutch researchers theorized that it's because the adult transsexuals were not able to pass, because you were dealing with mostly men. They weren't able to pass as women. And so the gender dysphoria remained even despite the treatments. And the Dutch clinicians thought, well, if we can just determine which of these kids is likely to grow up to be, the true transsexual, then if we just get to them earlier and intervene in their bodies earlier, this is going to solve the problem. And so that's where the Dutch protocol was born, and the use of puberty blockers actually had started, I believe, after they had already, started intervening in children's bodies with cross-sex hormones later. And even if you read those original studies, what you see is that the patients report like high rates of satisfaction, but then when it comes to measures of functionality, like being able to maintain a healthy sexual and romantic partner, to be able to maintain housing, employment, the ability to sort of be at peace with one's body, that all of these objective measures of functioning, which I would assume all of these things are really important in living a happy life, being able to have a partner and being able to have a job, these measures were all incredibly low. So the Dutch clinicians, instead of, again, because they're researchers, and every researcher who devotes their life to some kind of hypothesis, what they really want to do is to show that their hypothesis is correct. They really, really, like, they have this idea, and they really are invested in themselves being correct. So when you have like the nature of this data, because it is very qualitative, because you're asking people questions as opposed to trying to find some objective measurements of any improvement in the outcome of these patients, you become really invested in seeing a positive outcome, even in cases where there isn't one. And so a lot of these WPATH doctors, similar to the Dutch clinicians, what they saw is like they saw these people saying that they were much happier, but the evidence they were collecting didn't necessarily bear those conclusions out. So I think the motto of gender medicine should really be, I think this is a good thing. I think this is a good plan. I think we're on the right track here, but that damn evidence it's not showing up in the evidence, but we know it's true. It's like the concept, like gender medicine is entirely done away with the concept of the null hypothesis. So I think that back to your original question about what can parents do, it's first and foremost if you're a research-oriented type of person, it is good to know about the basics of gender medicine. But fundamentally, what you're dealing with is that, before you become some kind of an activist, you have to be an activist in your own home, and not an activist, but you have to parent your child through this really sort of these turbulent waters.
And you mentioned this at the event a couple of weeks ago, and I agree with you 100%. As a mother of 3 children, from teenagers down to elementary school, you have to start talking to them about this younger than probably most parents have ever had to talk, to their children about these topics, because they're coming into the schools, they're coming into their peers very, very early. And so they're either going to go with the crowd or with those outside, influences, or they're going to go with your family's values, whether it is faith, whether it is, identity, whatever it is. And if you've got to start talking to them, I think much younger. And you mentioned a kindergarten, and you mentioned a couple of things for parents to consider. And I think you're right about that. So why don't you talk about what you had said about these younger kids and what parents can say with their children as they're exploring their identities.
Absolutely. So I do think that you need to get started. A lot of parents don't want to have these conversations with their young kids because they think my kid won't be able to understand it. I don't want to introduce them to this idea. But the truth is that in 2024, in the United States or in any Western country, especially in English-speaking country, and I cannot stress this enough, these ideas travel with the English language, first and foremost. Most of these books, like In My Daddy's Belly or I Am Jazz, these books that are aimed at kids, they're trying to dissect these unfactual ideas and sort of to chew them up and process them heavily to the point where little kids can believe these things. So you, frankly, even though it's uncomfortable, you don't have the luxury of not having this type of conversation with your young child. Like, if you want your kid to be safe from this, you do have to get into those discussions at a much younger age. Don't tell your little 3-year-old about the fact that there are people who are like removing their genitals. That's obviously inappropriate for kids. But there are certain ways that you can talk to your kids in an age appropriate and developmentally appropriate way. Which is really that I think the big foundational thing here is that, like, the first ways in which little kids encounter this ideology is even something that you might have experienced when you were growing up, which is that you'll have like a little boy saying, oh, I don't want this pink toy or this pink cup because pink is for girls. Like, even before the advent of gender ideology, kids had extremely black and white thinking, not only about overwhelmingly, kids don't understand what biological sex actually is. Like, you can teach them that, boys have these body parts and girls have these body parts, and they might kind of understand that. But the concept or the psychological milestone of sex constancy, or the idea, like the sort of understanding that a kid comes to sometime between, in normal cases, between the ages of 5 and 8, that just because I'm dressing up as a princess doesn't mean that I'm a princess. Or just because I'm wearing nail polish and a wig, it doesn't mean that I'm literally a girl. Or, just because I'm dressing up as Spider-Man, it doesn't mean that I'm literally Spider-Man. Like, the concept that you are your biological sex, and that no matter what you wear, that is unchangeable, that is immutable, that's not going away. That is a realization that is emblematic of a certain stage of psychological development. And most kids don't really reach that until between ages 5 and 8. So your kid, like, if they're exposed to the idea that, these activities or these clothes are only for boys, or these activities and these clothes are only for girls, like, that is playing into their very rigid black and white thinking. And I think that, honestly, the most conservative thing that you can do these days to inoculate your kids against gender ideology is to allow your sons to put on, princess dresses if they want to paint their nails, and, to assure them that, this is something that, like, this doesn't make you a girl. Wanting to do these things doesn't make you a girl. You're a boy because you have a male body. And that, and to allow your girls to get muddy and dirty, and to not make them dress up as little princesses all the time, because in social media culture, I see especially, like, girls are forced into these hyper feminine roles as little toddlers, and little toddlers should be able to run and play and get their clothes dirty. And if you want to turn your toddler daughter into a princess, right, like, instead of allowing her to play and all these other things, like, I understand, again, why parents want to do it. I think a lot of parents think that if they make their kid, they put their kid into this extremely normative, gender conforming box, that somehow that's going to inoculate their kids against gender ideology. But I don't think it will. I think that that kid is just going to develop like a more rigid sense of, I am really a girl inside because I want to wear my sister's princess dress, or because I want to paint my nails, or I'm literally a boy because I want to like run around with my shirt off and play in the
Mm-hmm.
mud. Um,
Yeah,
like
that's an interesting perspective. Yeah.
like kids need to be, like, the most conservative thing you can do is not to shame your son if he wants to wear a dress. Like, if it becomes a thing where he wants to wear a dress all the time, it would be important to have a conversation with him about, like, look, in
Right.
our house we believe that there's nothing wrong with a boy wearing a dress, or that a boy wearing a dress is not a girl. But in the outside society, like in school, not everybody is going to be as accepting as mommy and daddy will. And so, like, you need to give your kids the tools to be resilient, whether it's with gender nonconformity, or whether it's that you
Mm-hmm.
have a kid who is likely on the autism spectrum and who is very nonconforming in those ways. You need to build in resilience into your kids and give them a safe place at home to really explore and play around with things, and not pathologize their natural play. Because I think a lot of parents are worried that if they allow their kids to engage in this type of gender nonconforming behavior, that it represents some kind of future catastrophe for their kid, like that
Right.
their kid will be, God forbid, gay, or that they'll want to, remove their genitals. And that's not true.
Yes.
Like, you don't
Right.
know how your kid is going to turn out. And the best way to entrench this negative self-perception of your kid is by shaming their natural play. Because ultimately what
Mm-hmm.
kids are doing is that they are playing adults. They are playing all kinds of real roles and make-believe roles in order to figure out, where am I and what am I in this sort of social stratification. It's really, really important that this behavior is not pathologized within kids, even if it might make you uncomfortable or worried about the future. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be some unfavorable outcome. More than likely, it means that your kid is just screwing around and playing in the way that kids play. It doesn't have to be a crisis. And I think it's really hard for parents to have a lot of these conversations. And so
we have to get over that. I'm sorry,
yeah.
we have to get over that and normalize among your parent peer groups that this is what we have to start doing intentionally with our children from a young age. And I would add to your very good advice to have these very transparent conversations openly with your kids young. Most of the American student population is in public schools. And in Illinois, the K through 12 policies that have come down from the state, from legislation, from these ideologues, is to infuse gender ideology in comprehensive sexual education, in classroom reading time. It's infused and pulsed in so many different ways. And so we do have this suggestion, and a lot of people do it every summer. This is the time to do it at awakeisle.com/forms. There are 3 different forms in triplicate. You can download them. And what this does is it puts on record your expectations as parents who are talking to their children about your family's values, about, all of the things we just mentioned. And what I've learned as a parent who's done this myself, and from other parents who do this, it actually starts really good conversations with staff. Because now staff know that you are an intentional parent. They are not going to create some scenario that probably doesn't exist, where all parents in their mind hate children, hate gay children, hate all of this stuff, right? And so this is a really good way for you to show these teachers that are entrusted with your children, counselors and nurses, that you are aware of gender ideology and it has no place in front of your child in the classroom. So this is just a really good thing for parents to do every school year, is to submit these forms and get on record, because you have to put the full armor over them, or people are going to create their own lessons that are outside of those bounds. And so every summer, parents have to do this. If they have their children in Illinois K through 12 schools, and probably anywhere else across the country, submit these forms and get on record and have a conversation with these teachers and the counselors. Just be open about it, because I have asked if teachers and counselors, pastors, faith leaders, camp counselors, if they look at your child on a roster, do they know, number one, have they made eye contact with you as the parents? We have a parenting crisis in this country. You drop your kids off and goodbye. Do they know what you look like? Do they know your family's values? Are you talking to them about this? Because it's going to be a lot harder for them to indoctrinate, whether they realize they're doing it or not, if they know your family's values and where you stand on these issues. So please submit these forms. We encourage people to do it across the country. These forms could be applied anywhere in any state. So just to lay around over your advice, I wanted to offer that, Maia.
Yeah, I think it's really important. There's the life that you have at home with your child and the ways in which these conversations happen behind closed doors. But like you've pointed out, Shannon, it's extremely prudent. And it's really, I think, an imperative upon every child who is in the school system where this type of ideological capture is rife, that, you know, teachers realize that there is opposition to these ideas. And also, I think that, like, I think it is hard for parents to have these types of conversations with their kids. I've noticed that, well, this wasn't a thing in my house because I come from this Soviet background where parents are totally unafraid to upset their kids. Like, it is just not, your kids' emotions, not even a factor, right? For better or for worse. That's the environment I grew up in. And so I think a lot of American parents are really afraid to be blunt with their kids. They're really afraid of upsetting their kids. They think that any kind of upheaval or any kind of disagreement or conflict is going to traumatize their kids, and that is false. There are certain things that will absolutely traumatize your kids. But having a disagreement or saying, no, I'm not going to affirm this identity, is not going to traumatize your kids. It's going to make them resilient, and it's going to force them to learn how to regulate their own emotions, and they're going to be better for it.
And you appreciate that your parents never affirmed you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I do wish that my distress was not totally just dismissed. And I do wish that it were more acceptable to be gay in my household, because that would have solved a lot. That would have allowed me to overcome a lot of the natural discomfort around my changing body. Like, that would have allowed puberty to work its wonders. I would just realize that I was a lesbian, and then, you know, have relationships and sort of come to peace with myself. I do understand where they were coming from. I understand that they were trying to protect me. Gay and trans were seen as sort of equally problematic, and I understand why. But I'm very grateful to them that they didn't affirm me. I'm very grateful to that, and I'm actually very grateful to even the ways in which, you know, the homosexuality bit was not considered to be acceptable. Like, I'm glad that I actually came up against that in my household, even though in the broader sort of progressive Western or American society, that's not a thing that I would have had to come up against, because it gave me so much more insight into the way, like, what it's like to be gay in Middle Eastern countries, and really how good we do have it in the West, and how even if you disagree with homosexuality, even if you think it's like really, really bad for society, the fact that it does exist and the fact that there are protections for homosexuals within Western society really attests to, you know, the type of society that is ultimately so worth living in, that people will leave their homelands and their families in order to pursue life in these types of liberal Western democracies. And so, and if you want to have these conversations to make it a little bit closer to home, I've been working with an Israeli social worker on a series of books for kids and for teenagers / young adults. And this professional that I've been working with is amazing. This social worker, she's the only professional in all of Israel who is speaking out against this nonsense and this madness with her name and face attached. And we've been working on a series of books for children and for adolescents and young adults. The two you see on the screen are the books for the teenagers and young adults. I've written a story with her based on my life, and that story is Leah's Journey. You can find it as like a download with a donation, an optional donation that goes to support Israeli detransitioners and just detrans activism in general below. But if you want to get it as a physical book, you can get both Being Joe and Leah's Journey on Amazon. You can get it as a physical book that will arrive to you. There are also books that we've done for little kids. So this coloring book, this is called What Makes a Dog, and I believe we'll be releasing the sequel, What Like a Dog Stays a Dog, I believe is what it's going to be called. And this is a coloring book that is basically meant to inoculate your children against the messages of the book I Am Jazz, which is a book of basically, it's about a little boy who wants to wear tutus and purple and sparkles, and his parents see something wrong with him. They basically take him to a doctor because they see a little boy who's very nonconforming as being some kind of pathology that needs to be corrected. They take him, he gets diagnosed with gender identity disorder, and his castration and mutilation, it plays out on screen in the TLC series I Am Jazz. So that book is being peddled to your kids. It's even being peddled to kids in Israel, by the way. They've translated it into Hebrew, and it's being peddled to kids in Israel as well. Crazy. So it's definitely being peddled to your kids. And this book, What Makes a Dog, there's a boys version and a girls version. It basically showcases and highlights that, hey, like some boys like to wear sports clothes and play football, and other boys are shy and quiet, and they like to dance, and they like to play with princess toys and dresses and whatever. And like, there is nothing about this boy's behavior, whatever he likes to wear, whatever, however he behaves, that will ever make him a girl. A boy is a boy, no matter what he likes and no matter how he plays, in the same way as big dogs and small dogs are all dogs, no matter how different they are. They're all still dogs because they were born dogs, and there's a boy's version and a girl's version. And you see on the left, this book where there's a question mark on it is basically for younger, either young adults or older teenagers, which is basically dispelling the myths and the lies of gender ideology one by one. And I think it's also good for parents to read these books. Obviously, pre-screen these books before you give them to your kids, but you have nothing to worry about with these books because they are meant to inoculate your kids against the black and white negative messaging that they get in school, which is that if you're a little boy who wants to wear dresses, or if you're a little girl who wants to have short hair and throw things at other kids, that somehow, this doesn't make you a non-conforming boy or girl, that this literally means that your healthy body is a pathology that needs to be corrected, and that you're born in the wrong body. Like, these are the messages that they're peddling at your kids. They're not just giving your kids labels about non-binary and pansexual. They're indoctrinating your kids into the black and white thinking, which it should be the job of literally every educational institution ever to break your kid out of, because it is your kid's developmentally natural tendency to be stuck in black and white thinking that is developmentally appropriate. And these schools are stunting your child's psychological development by telling them that, by basically inducing distress and inducing self-hatred. And so the point of these books is really to give your kids at different ages and different sort of developmental levels. And we're working on books for the age range of 8 to 12 years old. So like, bookmark this page and stay tuned for that, because we're trying to really hit every single demographic, from the moment that they could be exposed to these ideas to the moment that they're old enough to make these types of irreversible medical decisions on their own, and really trying to dispel those negative messages. So if it is really hard for you to have these conversations with your kids, because I understand it is awkward, like parents don't want to talk about this stuff with their kids. And unfortunately, we live in a society where you have to, like, you really don't have any other choice. So these books are a really good way to go about that. So that's another bit of advice, I think. That's
great. And thank you for that. And I'm so glad that your story is in this book. And I like the bow tie on the graphic on the cover. That's awesome. Your trademark. And so we will link all of these resources, as we have, with including a resource from January, Little John's live stream. That's actually a PDF packet that you can get, and it's geared towards faith leaders who are going to have to minister to families that are navigating this journey. And it's rooted in the biblical sense, right? And so I'm going right back to the Old Testament. And so there are so many different resources for people, depending on where you are and how you're shepherding your communities. So we will link this, and that is great. And again, I would say people should go to the Partners for Ethical Care event link that took place 2 weeks ago. Everybody's perspective, from yours and the whole entire panel, really good advice for parents of children of all ages, including parents of adult children that have been considering or have already begun engaging in transition. That is probably some of the most painful conversations I have had, is with parents who feel totally helpless because their child is over 18 and they are going to be making a decision possibly for medicalization. And so you can just see the heartbreak and the stress on their faces and on their bodies. And some really good advice was given from the detransitioner panel as to how to parent a child that is going through this journey, and just gave really, really good advice. And it's really nothing profound, but still people need to hear it. Love your child, keep a relationship going with them. Don't let the child gaslight you, right? But at the same time, don't break the relationship. Don't let this contagion break your family. So they give really good advice, and I encourage people to go back to that recording. Again, we will share these book links. What else do you have to say, Maia, in closing to everybody watching? Because you are a very bright individual. You have such a high level understanding of how we've arrived to this point in Western society. You've lived abroad. I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned you fact checked your friends. That's a really good piece of advice to those of us that are traversing this in a time of cancel culture, and there's so much hatred. And look, we're on like hate lists, and people target us and call us anti-gay bigots and white supremacists. I mean, all these terrible things. But you had the chutzpah to say, you know what, I'm going to fact check my friends and I'm going to provide resources. What other advice do you have for the everyday person that is like, where do I start with this? How do I even start a conversation with anybody? Like, what's your final bit of advice or chestnuts?
So I guess I have two things. The first thing is like Western society was captured by these ideologues, and it's alarming, and it should really alarm everybody, the rate at which these bad and unevidenced ideas were able to infiltrate our American institutions one by one and proliferate themselves, not only internally from one institution to the next, but also externally from one English speaking country to the next English speaking country to other Western European countries that don't speak English, and now all the way to the Middle East. Like, we really need to, I know that there are a lot of parent activists, and what you're doing, whether you're public or not, whether you're dealing with, how this concept or this whole, I guess, this entire phenomenon is relating to your kid. Maybe you have a gender questioning kid, and what you're doing with your kid is incredibly, important. And also, if you want to be like an outward facing activist, like, first and foremost, your kid is the priority. And I think every parent already believes that. But additionally, and that's really, really important to keep in mind, like all the researchers who are analyzing the evidence base and poking holes in it left, right, and center to show that none of these treatments really have any kind of evidence to underpin them as any kind of ethical medical care. But really, like, also the campaigners who are trying to, keep men out of women's sports spaces, bathrooms, prisons, and the like. And also, the parents who are campaigning to get this monstrous, disastrous, regressive, dangerous ideology out of their kids' schools, all very important. But I think that while we are really focused, in our own sort of siloed communities, fighting, the men in women's prisons, men in women's sports, the gender ideology in schools, we need to take a step back for a second and really figure out, how did we get to this point in the first place? Because it is something that's really remarkable. This sort of collision of gender medicine and of the transgender zeitgeist consuming all of our institutions. Like, there are reasons why it happened, and we really need to look at our institutions, and we need to have like a really deep, sober look before we have banned all of the gender affirming care for kids and all of these other concerns. Like, before as we're prying gender ideology out of every single Western institution that it has dug its grimy little claws in, we need to realize that the fact that we've allowed this ideology to sink its claws into all of our institutions means that when we try to pull this ideology out of our institutions are going to be even weaker after we pull this ideology out than they were before. And they were already weak before because they accepted these bad, unevidenced ideas simply because of activist coercion. And that should frighten every single person who cares about democracy and who cares about freedom. It should frighten every single intellectual, because it means that our institutions, and like when we're teaching kids about civics and about checks and balances, and we're teaching them to be proud of the democratic safeguards of the society in which they live, we need to realize that we actually have to be able to actualize upon that promise to our kids. Because as it stands, our institutions are incredibly weak. They're incredibly vulnerable to ideological capture. And we need to have a broader picture here, because after we ban gender affirming care for minors, for example, right, we're going to have an entire generation of kids who have been indoctrinated into believing that their bodies are wrong, and that if they don't get puberty blockers, that they're going to commit suicide. They are told this. And once these treatments are banned, I guess I call it an iatrogenic placebo, because it's a placebo that makes them think that they're actually getting better while inflicting harm upon them at every step of the way. When they're not given this iatrogenic placebo of the gender affirming care, the puberty blockers, whatever, and they've been told for their entire lives that this is going to save their life, then you're going to see a really massively wave of even more vulnerable kids. And the mental health infrastructure isn't there to cushion the blow of that. Also, doctors need to start thinking about, like, while it is these gender clinics who are doing these procedures, these incredibly invasive and increasingly more so invasive procedures, especially with the genital surgeries that they're doing on little boys to sidestep their lack of pubertal development, and using the colon and all these things, all these procedures that are basically having to sidestep the lack of pubertal development of these children means that like the procedures that these kids are going to undergo are increasingly more experimental and more dangerous. And you might have, as an emergency room doctor, a patient who comes into your clinic, into your emergency room, unconscious and unable to advocate for themselves. Their legal documents are colluding with this legal fiction that they are a member of the sex that they are actually not. So doctors and emergency room, nurses and technicians are going to, unfortunately, be in the spot where they're literally operating under false premises. And we know that male and female bodies are different and that they have different medical needs. And when doctors can't even determine the biological sex of a person who comes to them unconscious and unable to advocate for themselves, this is a really dangerous situation. So we have to start, while it is important to get into these individual siloed debates about the different ways in which gender ideology has infiltrated Western institutions, we really have to start to be planning the day after now. Because if we don't strengthen our institutions, if we don't learn from this, if we don't learn from the ways in which this ideology has captured our institutions, we have no way of preventing
and take them back. Yeah, right.
We have no way of preventing the next bad idea that has fascistic tendencies, that has the potential to absolutely subvert our sovereignty, subvert borders. Like that's what the trans movement is trying to do. It has its own flag, right? Like it's trying to subvert national borders. It's an international trans flag. It's subverting borders. It's subverting sovereignty. It's basically trying to establish its own caliphate. Where it runs
at our Woke 101 event for Awake Americans, we had Noelle Merring there, and she was talking about how the flag is a sign of a regime change. So to your point, it's all tied together. All of this is tied together, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, additionally, I think that what's really important to remember is that a lot of parents think that they feel hopeless because they can't get their kid out of public school because they can't afford it, because it's a big ask. Like everybody pays taxes and your kids should be able to go to the schools that you pay taxes for. And I think a lot of parents feel hopeless that because their kids are going into a public school system that is overwhelmingly ideologically captured, that they can't inoculate their kids and that they don't have any hope. But that's not true. You as a parent are the fundamentally most important influence in your child's life. In fact, the same-sex parent of that child is the most important role model in that kid's life. And the opposite sex parent is also extremely important influence in that kid's life, albeit the same-sex parent has the most power. And this has been known for a while, right? And so you are the first and foremost, like most important influence in your kid's life. And so you do have the power. You know your kid the best. And there are a lot of resources out there, like the Gender a Wider Lens podcast or Stephanie Wynn's podcast. I think it's called Just Some Therapist or something like that. Or if you look at what January Littlejohn or Erin Friday or Gabrielle Clark or any of these other parents who have gotten their kids to desist, or these therapists and clinicians who have worked with these population of gender dysphoric youth, with their parents, with detransitioners, like these people who have been down this road before have a lot of really good advice for you. But, and I will tell this to all parents, your kid is your kid. This advice, use the advice from all of these people I've just listed to inform your war strategy, because it is really, really important to have a war strategy and to not get so caught up in your own emotions that it impedes your ability to strategize. And I don't fault anybody for having emotions. For me, it's particularly easy to put them aside because I have this kind of logical orientation. And I think that every parent, like if you need to cry and if you're angry, go with your partner somewhere, go out of the house or go into a room where your kid's not going to stumble in on you. Go to your own therapist. Like, frankly, it's better for you to have a therapist when you have a gender questioning teen than for your kid to have a therapist.
100%. Well, we have a WPATH therapist at Wheaton College here in Illinois. A WPATH doctor has a gender and sexuality clinic at a Christian college, and he gets funneled to all these different churches. So there are some bad actors that could be the wrong therapist or counselor. Abigail Schreier has highlighted some of these concerns too. So Partners for Ethical Care has great resources and referrals if you're Illinois or beyond to find the right therapist that will not lean further into this gender ideology, for sure.
Yeah, it's really important to know who's out there. And I think that you and your partner, or if you're a single parent, it's you and whatever other support system you have. It's basically you are on your kid's team, even though it may seem as though, and your kid will certainly perceive it as a war between you and your kid. What your kid can't realize is that you are on your kid's side, and everybody else is not on your kid's side. They may think they're on your kid's side, but they are not, right? Because they're operating from the premise that dangerous and experimental interventions that cause harm to a healthy body, in 100% of cases, some harm being like, I guess, less noticeable or more of a slow burn to the point where you don't realize you've been harmed until you've been harmed. That was me in binding. It's like a sweet poison. It's like antifreeze, which is why they added, you're being poisoned and you don't realize it. It's why they added a bitter aftertaste to antifreeze in the early 2000s, because so many people were like poisoning their intimate partners with it. And a lot of these interventions are the same way. Like, they do harm slowly, whether it's something like binding or tucking. You get used to and you assimilate the pain and the discomfort of these interventions to such an extent that it actually further disconnects you from your own body. So, I mean, if you're
transhumanism, yeah.
It's transhumanism, and it's like it plays perfectly into the psychology of a developing teenager who's uncomfortable with their body, and especially an autistic teenager or a teenager with autistic traits who already kind of live so much in their head, and the sensory, input from the world is so overwhelming that they're disconnected from their bodies as a baseline. So I would say that actually a few good, before we end, some good, really good practical tips are really, and this brings me back to the second thing I wanted to discuss, which is that Western kids, especially American kids, and I cannot stress this enough, American kids are facing a meaning crisis. Whereas religion in previous years, or whereas like cultural rituals and sort of milestones like quinceañeras or bar and bat mitzvahs or any other coming of age ceremony, whereas like in previous years, this is a way for a child to sort of understand their evolution from infant to toddler to child to adult. Through these milestones that had a community backing them. Like our societies used to have these types of cultural influences. And for me, the most important way to, like, what ultimately ended up, I guess, allowing me to be in a country that didn't subscribe or didn't wholesale subscribe to gender ideology, because it is unfortunately making its way into Israel. But it was the fact that I grew up speaking English and Russian, that I learned Arabic when I was 12. It was much easier to learn Arabic after speaking 2 languages growing up, and that I was allowed to learn Hebrew because I'd already spoken 3 languages. I went to a country, I spoke 4 languages. I was immersed in this whole new brain space, and I realized that a lot of these American talking points and a lot of this like American cultural sort of stuff with the way that gender ideology and Marxism is really influencing our society here in the West, the ways in which that is dangerous and that is not inherent. And I think that if you come from an immigrant family, like I definitely have a lot more specialized advice for you, and I'm sure I'll do more videos, about that on my YouTube channel. So stay tuned for those. But generally, if you have a kid, whether you're an immigrant or whether you're like, white bread, apple pie, American family, I don't know if that's the right expression, but whether you're like American through and through and you don't know what your roots are, maybe it's good to go in search of your roots. Maybe it's good to do like a DNA test and don't put your name on it if you're worried about the privacy. Put some fake name and figure out like, where do your roots come from? Enroll your kid in some kind of a language immersion program if you have those resources. Get them out of their environment and get them into an environment like, if you like, when you take away their iPad or their internet access, you have to replace it with something, because that kid is using the internet to cope. You can't just take it away and let the other siblings use their internet, take away the trans identified kid's internet, and then just expect it's going to go away. Like when my parents did that, first of all, it made me resent my brother. So there was that. But also, I just went to the library and I started reading.
Got the internet there.
Trans stuff. Exactly. I started reading books about this trans stuff. So your kid is using this internet as a coping mechanism. You need to replace that coping mechanism with something. And I think that a lot of these kids are trying to, and the reason why I think it's a Western meaning crisis is because when I see the types of Israeli kids who get sucked into trans, the first and foremost, they're the kids from English-speaking families or who have just mastered the English language because of being on the internet. And they're the secular English-speaking kids who they see their more religious peers not having some kind of a meaning crisis because they believe in God and they have all these rituals. But then these secular kids have a meaning crisis because they're in this extremely religious, very spiritual, very important land, but yet they're struggling with their adolescence, and they are not raised in a family that necessarily abides by these religious rituals that make a lot of sense out of horrifying meaning-making events like wars and death and destruction. So they're having a meaning crisis, and those are first and foremost the kids who get sucked into trans on the internet, and they take it into their in-person friend groups, and then they translate these ideas into Hebrew, and then it really spreads within the secular society. And secondarily, it's the gay kids who come from ultra-Orthodox Jewish backgrounds or super strict Muslim backgrounds. They go into gay organizations. Well, no, they're shunned by their religious communities for being gay. They go to gay youth organizations and immediately are asked what their pronouns are. They have so much shame around being gay, and immediately they're funneled into trans. So that's why I have the types of advice that I have for Western youth, which is find other ways to make meaning with your kids. Connect with your
religion. This doesn't become their religion.
Exactly. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for some, they'll talk about their trans elders, right? Like there's this whole thing with turning gay people from the past into saying that they were actually trans or whatever it is, or looking at some character in a book and saying this is evidence of trans. Your kid is looking for their forefathers. Teach your kid about who their great grandparents were. Go on Ancestry. Do something like connect your kids with their past. Connect your kids with a cultural identity, even if it's not theirs. Connect them with a different cultural identity, because it's incredibly, incredibly important for them to realize that they didn't just appear on planet Earth 12 to 14 years ago, that they come from a long line of other people who they may be able to see themselves in, people who, predated them. And it's really important for them to have their feet firmly planted, on a timeline, on a chronological timeline of those who've come before them. It is possibly one of the single most important things you could do for your trans-identified teenager.
That is amazing advice, Maia. Thank you for that. And you reminded me to share this. Let me see. Let me get this on here. So my friend James Lindsay has the book, The Queering of the American Child, and I highly recommend it. And in my recommendation, I shared that, I think it's a must read for any parent, any educator, and any citizen who believes in protecting children from this, as we now know, radical and harmful indoctrination. So if people want to take a pretty sobering look back, because you mentioned the institutions and the capture, this book goes into that in a very entry-level, easy way for people to understand, right? And James Lindsay in New Discourses has many different podcasts and resources that if people want to get even higher level than this, there are plenty of ways to do that. But this is, I think, a pretty good entry-level backstory into how we've gotten into this issue, into this problem. And if you go to queeringbook.com, this is where you can find the different ways you can get this book. And again, it's a very easy entry-level understanding of how we've gotten to this point. And as I've said before in other events, I think I said it at Partners for Ethical Care, if you don't know the best way to maybe broach the subject with a friend, because I believe that detransitioner stories are the missing gap. It's missing from social media. It's missing from the mainstream conversation. To just simply ask a friend, whether it's at a sporting event or in your faith group, just ask if they've heard a detransitioner story before. Have you heard a detransitioner story? Most people are going to say no. And you can say, wow, I learned so much from Maia Poet. I would really like to pass along a link so you can hear her remarks. I just learned so much about the gender ideology, her story, how she emerged from it with so much hope and inspiration. Make it a positive thing for people to learn more about, because most people, Maia, I think, are still so incredibly naive and or really uncomfortable. So that's why, Partners for Ethical Care and you having your YouTube and social media, as more detransitioner stories become mainstream, it will be helpful for the wave of people that you mentioned, a generation of kids that we haven't even realized yet are going to need our support and our compassion and our grace, right? So you're embarking on a journey that I think is just beginning, and you're pretty new to being a voice right now for detransitioners and for families. So we're so grateful that you have made yourself public. I know it's not easy, but I think that you're going to bring a lot of inspiration and hope to a lot of different families. So I'm really grateful that you came on tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and for everybody who's stuck through, the 2 hours of this live stream. I really appreciate your attention and your care and your passion about this issue. it really will take all of us. And it really is a battle that we need to fight on multiple fronts, all while keeping in mind the day after, because ultimately all of our kids are at stake. And it's not a hopeless situation, especially if we all sort of put our minds together. And really, just the exchange of information is incredibly important. So I really thank everybody for watching through this, and thank you to Awake Illinois, and thank you to you, Shannon, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Of course, it's my pleasure. And thanks to everyone, yes, who did watch this. And please share it. Share all of the live streams that we have done. So many different perspectives, from medical to parent. All of it is really needed to fight in this fight, because there is a war on our children. And fortunately, you, Maia, you have another shot at life, quite literally. You could have probably been killed many times in the war in Israel. And here you are, and you have a great purpose and journey ahead of you. And so I'm so glad to connect with you and hear more about your story tonight. So all of these live streams are at awakeil.com/fight, because we are not backing down. It doesn't matter how many hate lists you put us on. It doesn't matter how many times you call us names. We have a titanium backbone to protect the kids. So keep trying, haters. It's not going to stop us. We're going to have more of these episodes. And if you have a recommendation for somebody who would like to come on and share more resources or share a story, please let me know, let our organization know, and we would be glad to highlight it, because we're in this for the long haul. So you can find Maia at the Peace Poet 99 on X. And then we also have the YouTube link that we will post all this to the blog, all the resources and the ways to hear more about you, Maia, as you continue in your advocacy journey. So thank you so much to Maia, and thanks to all of you who tuned in tonight. Have a great weekend, and God bless. Thank you. Bye.